Audrey, a young woman with blonde hair and expressive eyes, had recently graduated from university. Her diploma, earned after years of hard work, promised prospects for a professional future. However, she had yet to find a job. Audrey's parents supported her in everything, although they were concerned that their daughter hadn't yet settled into her life. Perhaps they expected too much of her, but Audrey knew she could always rely on them. Audrey's family had long been friends with the family of Tanner, her peer. This friendship went back to the time when they were all in school together, and the children had practically grown up under the same roof. They often spent time together, and their parents were almost inseparable friends. Every holiday and every gathering reinforced the notion that Audrey and Tanner, though not related, appeared to be like siblings. They had known each other since childhood, and there was a deep mutual understanding and warm friendship between them. Like Audrey, Tanner had also recently completed his university studies. He earned a degree in law and was actively seeking his place in the professional world. Tanner's parents wanted to celebrate his success and decided to organize a joint trip for the children. Along with Audrey's parents, they planned to give the young adults a gift, a trip to Germany. It was meant to be a chance for them to relax after the intense years of study and enjoy carefree moments before diving into adult life. The trip was conceived as a way to mark their achievements, but no one could have foreseen how it would affect their future. During the trip, something changed between Audrey and Tanner. What had once been a simple childhood friendship unexpectedly took on a new hue. They began to see each other differently, as if meeting for the first time. The same jokes, the same conversations that had once been routine now evoked different emotions. Tanner no longer seemed to Audrey like just a childhood friend, but someone closer, someone she now saw in a completely new light. Audrey felt her heart race every time Tanner was near. They both sensed a shift, but were afraid to speak about it aloud. It was something new and unfamiliar to them, something difficult to put into words. As they walked through the ancient streets of Germany, they were not only discovering new cities, but also each other. On the way home from the airport, Audrey was filled with mixed emotions. She was happy about the new experiences, but also felt nervous and uncertain. Her thoughts kept returning to what had transpired between them during the trip. She couldn't settle on one thought and kept asking herself, what will our parents think? Will they understand? In the car, Tanner also seemed lost in thought but remained silent. He knew that something had shifted in their relationship, but it was difficult for him to accept without knowing how their families would react. After all, they had spent so many years thinking of each other as almost family, and now everything had changed. When they arrived at Audrey's house, the first thing she did was rush to her mother to share her impressions of the trip. Audrey spoke enthusiastically about every detail, about how she and Tanner had shared new moments, how they had watched sunrises together, how much fun they had had. But her mother, Diane, didn't seem as excited. At first, Audrey didn't pay much attention, but as she continued her story, she noticed something was off. Diane listened to her daughter, but her expression gradually changed. At first, it was mere indifference, but soon Audrey noticed a shadow of concern in her mother's eyes. Each time Audrey mentioned Tanner, Diane became more and more anxious and tense. Finally, when Audrey finished her story, Diane lifted her head and said something Audrey hadn't expected at all. You shouldn't continue your relationship with Tanner. Those words stunned Audrey. She couldn't believe her ears. How could this be? Her mother had always been supportive of their friendship, always encouraged their bond. And now, here she was, firmly forbidding her from seeing Tanner. Mom, what do you mean? Audrey asked in surprise, trying to understand the reason behind such a reaction. Diane looked at her daughter seriously and quietly said, There are things between our families that you don't know about. I don't want you to experience the pain I went through. A relationship with Tanner won't bring you happiness. Audrey was shocked. She had never heard her mother speak this way about their friends. She knew their families were close, but had never suspected any hidden issues. But what struck her the most was the coldness and certainty in Diane's voice. Audrey wanted to argue, to convince her mother that her feelings for Tanner were real, but the words stuck in her throat. "This can't end well, Audrey," Diane repeated, looking at her daughter with regret. "I want you to listen to me." Those words hit Audrey hard. She had hoped for support, for understanding, but instead, she was met with a harsh prohibition. Deep down, she felt there was more between their families than just friendship, but she didn't know how to make sense of it. The next few days passed in a tense atmosphere. Audrey tried to understand why her mother was so adamant about forbidding her from seeing Tanner. She tried several times to talk to her father, but he seemed to avoid the conversations. His silent agreement with Diane's actions only deepened her doubts. Tanner, too, noticed changes in his family. He didn't understand why his parents had become more distant, why their faces darkened every time Audrey was mentioned. Something was clearly happening, but they didn't know how to confront it. Over the next few days, Audrey felt increasingly restless. Her meetings with Tanner became rarer, as if an invisible wall had risen between them. Every time she tried to plan another meeting, she felt an unspoken pressure from her family. This was especially evident in her mother's behavior, who had become more closed off and reserved lately. Every time Audrey mentioned Tanner, Diane looked at her with anxiety and seemed to avoid the topic altogether. Audrey knew she needed to find out the reasons behind her mother's change in behavior, but she didn't know where to start. Her mother had always been her reliable support, but now there was a cold distance between them, making Audrey feel uncertain. One evening, when Audrey returned home after a long, hard day, she decided to speak with her mother again. She was troubled by the growing distance between them, which felt too artificial. Something about Diane's behavior seemed unnaturally anxious. It wasn't just motherly concern. Audrey sensed that something deeper lay behind it, perhaps something her mother had been hiding all these years. The control Diane usually had over situations now seemed overly sharp, as if she were trying to protect not only her daughter, but also herself from a painful truth. "Mom, please, tell me the truth. Why are you so adamantly against my relationship with Tanner?" Audrey asked again, her voice calm but tense. She knew this question had been gnawing at her for days, and now she was ready for the answer, even if it would be unpleasant. Diane sighed heavily. Her hands nervously fidgeted with the edge of her scarf, as if she were trying to find calm in the familiar gesture. She knew this conversation would happen eventually, but she had no desire to revisit the memories she had long tried to bury in her mind. The past, which she thought was long behind her, was now resurfacing, bringing with it pain and fear. "Audrey, I've tried to keep this inside for so long. I thought it would stay in the past, that you would never find out," she began, her voice quiet and measured, but filled with deep anxiety. She didn't raise her eyes to her daughter, as if afraid to see her reaction. "But now, when you talk about Tanner, I see that it's all coming back. There are things you don't know and won't understand right away. What happened between our families?" Audrey listened to every word, her tension mounting, her heart racing in her chest, sensing something bad. She knew that what Diane was about to say could change her entire understanding of life, but she was ready to hear it, no matter how difficult the truth would be. "When your father and I were young, we spent a lot of time with Tanner's parents," Diane continued, her voice trembling now. "We were friends, just like you and Tanner are now. But one day, something happened that changed our relationship forever. It was many years ago, when you were still a child, and I hoped you would never have to know about it." Audrey felt her world begin to crumble. All those years she had lived, believing her family was a model of stability, now seemed like nothing more than an illusion. Her breathing quickened as she finally dared to ask the question that had been pounding in her head. "What happened?" she barely managed to say, feeling her throat go dry. Diane paused, as if gathering strength before speaking the words that would change their lives. Her face was full of pain, and she finally looked up at her daughter. "Your father and Victor, Tanner's father, were always very close friends," she began to explain. "One time, when we all went on a trip together, something happened that should never have happened. Between Victor and me, Something happened that changed everything. Audrey stared at her mother, unable to believe her ears. Her mind couldn't process what she had just heard. All those years of friendship between their families now appeared in a new, cold, and cruel light. Her mother had betrayed her father with Victor, Tanner's father. It seemed so unreal that Audrey couldn't find the strength to believe it. "You're saying you had an affair with Tanner's father," Audrey said coldly, barely believing the words coming from her own mouth. Diane nodded silently. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with deep regret. She knew that these words hurt not only Audrey but herself as well. It was just once, Audrey. Only once. But that was enough to change everything. "I told your father back then that it was a mistake, and we decided to forget about it. But from that point on, our relationship with Tanner's family was never the same." Audrey felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The world she thought was stable and secure was crumbling. All those years she had spent with Tanner, playing, laughing, sharing secrets, now seemed laced with lies. And what about Tanner? Does he know? Audrey asked sharply, her voice trembling with outrage. "No, he doesn't know," Diane replied softly. "His parents decided to keep it quiet too. We all agreed not to tell you kids, to protect your friendship. But now, as all of this resurfaces, I'm afraid you might go through the same pain I did. I don't want that for you." Audrey felt her heart tighten with pain and anger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me live in a lie?" Diane sighed deeply. "I thought it would stay in the past. I wanted to protect you from it. But now I see I made a mistake." Audrey couldn't listen anymore. Overcome with anger and disappointment, she found it hard to breathe. Without saying another word, she abruptly stood from her chair and walked out of the room, leaving her mother alone with her regret. The next morning, after a sleepless night of thinking, Audrey made a difficult decision. She couldn't stay silent anymore and knew she had to talk to Tanner. The things her mother had revealed haunted her. The longer she kept it to herself, the heavier the burden grew. But how could she tell Tanner that their families were bound by a secret of betrayal? How would this affect their already fragile relationship, strained by the weight of unspoken emotions? Audrey had no idea how to start the conversation. She feared it might destroy whatever they still had between them, but she couldn't continue living in a lie. That morning, feeling anxious, she sent him a message. "I need to talk to you. Can we meet at our cafe at 3? Tanner's reply was short and immediate. "Sure." When she arrived at the cafe, Tanner was already seated at their favorite table by the window. He always showed up early, one of the little things she appreciated about him. But today, something was different in his expression. There was a distant look in his eyes, and it only heightened her anxiety. "Hey," he said as Audrey approached the table. "You don't seem like yourself today. Is everything okay?" Audrey sat down across from him. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure Tanner could hear it. She couldn't meet his gaze, feeling as though the words were stuck in her throat. It was hard to begin, but she knew she couldn't delay any longer. "Tanner, I need to talk to you," she began quietly, barely holding back her emotions. His face immediately grew serious. He leaned in, showing that he was ready to listen. Audrey stayed silent for a few more seconds, trying to gather her thoughts, but she felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. "I found out something from my mom," she started, searching for the right words. Tanner didn't interrupt, but his expression changed. Audrey continued, telling him about the affair that had taken place between their parents years ago. She detailed how her mother and Victor, Tanner's father, had a one-time affair that, despite being a mistake, forever changed their families. Tanner listened quietly, not saying a word. With each of her words, his face grew more tense and his skin paler. He seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. When Audrey finished her story, the cafe was enveloped in a silence that felt endless. She could feel her hands trembling from the nervous tension. "You mean to say that our parents, that my mom cheated on my dad with yours?" Tanner finally spoke, his voice hollow, as if the words were sinking into his own thoughts. Audrey nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Her heart ached with the uncertainty of how he would react. Now, everything depended on him, and she felt herself losing control over the situation. Tanner leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. His gaze was fixed somewhere outside the window, as if he were trying to escape in his mind from what he had just heard. He remained silent, and the quiet was worse than any words. Audrey didn't know what to say, her eyes briefly scanning his face, but she could see that he wasn't really there with her. "I don't know what to do now," Tanner said softly after a long pause. "This is too much. How could we not have known?" His words hit Audrey hard. She didn't know how to respond either. It all felt unreal, like some kind of nightmare. Their relationship, once so simple and natural, now hung by a fragile thread because of the secrets their parents had kept. "Maybe we need to give ourselves some time," Audrey finally suggested, trying to find a way out of the situation. "Maybe if we take a step back and think this through, it'll get easier." Tanner nodded slowly, but it seemed like he wasn't really listening anymore. His thoughts were far away. He looked confused and at the same time, deeply troubled. What they had just learned was too big of a blow, and he didn't know how to handle it. Audrey watched him, feeling the growing distance between them. She understood that this wasn't a conversation that could be easily resolved. They were both lost in this new reality and didn't know how to move forward. Everything that once felt stable and certain was now shattered. "You're right," Tanner said after a while. "Maybe time will help us figure out what to do next." Audrey nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. This wasn't the outcome she had hoped for. She had wanted to hear different words from him, words of support or certainty. But now, she knew they were both too shaken and hurt to make any decisions. They were standing at a crossroads. When they said goodbye outside the cafe, Audrey felt a heavy stone settle in her heart. Tanner walked away without looking back. She watched him go, sensing that he was drifting away not only physically but emotionally. At that moment, she realized that their relationship might never be the same again. Audrey slowly made her way home, reflecting on what had happened. She tried to understand how everything could have shattered their world so quickly. Their lives, which had seemed so predictable, had now turned into a series of questions without easy answers. When she returned home, her mother, Diane, was sitting in the kitchen. Audrey could no longer look at her without a bitter sense of betrayal. Her mother had wanted to protect her from pain, but now Audrey felt as though she had been living in a lie all these years. She walked past her mother quickly, not saying a word. Diane looked at her with pity, but she didn't try to speak. They both knew that words would change nothing now. The next few days passed in complete solitude for Audrey as she tried to figure out what to do next. She knew her relationship with Tanner had changed forever. But could they find a way to understand each other after everything that had happened? The days following that conversation with Tanner stretched on endlessly, as if time had slowed down. Audrey felt confused and empty. Her meeting with Tanner had left a painful mark on her heart. She constantly thought about their future and couldn't find any answers. Each morning, she woke up with the same anxiety, as if a single script was playing in her head over and over. She wanted to believe that their love could overcome this obstacle, but the truth that had surfaced felt like an insurmountable wall between them. Their relationship, which had seemed so strong and genuine, now felt fragile and precarious. Audrey couldn't understand how this had happened. She longed to find the strength within herself to restore their closeness, but every time she thought about their parents' betrayal, it became hard to breathe. Eventually, Audrey realized there was another person she needed to talk to, her father. She couldn't come to terms with the fact that Peter had known about all this and had remained silent for so many years. Her father, who had always seemed to her a model of honesty and morality, now appeared to be part of a massive lie. She needed to hear the truth directly from him, to understand why he had allowed this secret to remain hidden for so long. One evening, when her father returned home from work, Audrey gathered the courage to speak. She stood at the threshold of the living room, waiting for him to take off his coat and settle onto the couch. "Dad, I need to talk to you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though everything inside her trembled. Peter looked at his daughter in surprise. He sensed something in her gaze, something that made him drop his usual ease and take the situation seriously. He nodded and invited her to join him on the couch. "I'm listening, Audrey," he sighed, feeling that the moment he had long dreaded was finally upon him. Audrey sat down next to her father, but there was now more distance between them than ever before. She felt alienated, even though this was the person she had always relied on. Gathering all her strength, she prepared to say what had long waited for expression. "Mom told me about what happened between her and Victor, about the affair." She finally spoke, her voice trembling with tension. "Did you know about this too?" Peter didn't respond right away. He seemed to weigh each word before saying anything. His face was shadowed by a seriousness that had not been typical for him. He looked at his daughter with deep sorrow in his eyes, as if this burden had been heavy on his shoulders for years. "Yes, I knew," he said quietly after a long pause. "I found out after it all happened. Your mother and I decided that the best choice was to stay silent about it and move on for your sake. We tried to keep the family together." Audrey felt everything inside her twist. She couldn't believe that her father, the person she had always trusted, had kept this from her for so many years. She had always considered him a model of honesty, and now he was admitting to being part of the cover-up of the truth. "Why did you never tell me?" Her voice broke with anger. She was barely holding back her emotions. "Why did you and Mom keep this from me?" Peter sighed heavily and ran a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away the fatigue that had built up over all those years of silence. "We thought it would be better for you," he replied calmly, though his voice trembled with internal struggle. "You were still young. We wanted to protect you from pain, from something that could ruin your childhood." Audrey couldn't contain her emotions any longer. She stood up sharply, her face filled with outrage. "Protect me from pain?" she shouted, unable to control her anger any longer. "You think hiding this from me my whole life is protection? I grew up not knowing the truth, and now this lie has ruined my life." Peter sat silently, his head bowed as if he felt the weight of all those years of silence crashing down on him. He understood he had made a mistake, but he didn't know how to fix it. He had no answer to his daughter's accusations. "You know this has ruined my relationship with Tanner," Audrey continued, her voice shaking with anger. "What are we supposed to do now? You all kept this from us, and now I don't know what to do." Her words cut like a sharp knife, and Peter felt it keenly. He saw how his silence had turned against him, how it had shattered the trust between him and his daughter. "I understand how you feel," he finally said quietly, his voice filled with remorse. "If I could change everything, I would, but I can't. We made a mistake that's now coming back to haunt us." Audrey paused, her anger gradually fading, giving way to a sense of emptiness. She didn't know how to move forward. Her feelings for Tanner hadn't vanished, but now they had become so tangled that she wasn't sure if they could be salvaged. "Maybe you and Tanner really need to give yourselves some time," Peter continued, trying to offer some comfort. "Don't rush. Maybe it will help you understand what to do next." Audrey sighed. She wanted to say something biting, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling that she could no longer continue this conversation. She got up from the couch and walked to her room, leaving her father alone with his thoughts and regrets. She knew it would take her a long time to understand how to move forward. The main question was whether she and Tanner could overcome all of this together. A few days after her conversation with her father, Audrey decided to do what she had long feared. She reached out to Tanner and invited him to meet. They were both weighed down by what had happened, but Audrey understood there was one more thing she needed to clarify before making any conclusions about their future. They met again at the cafe that had become a silent witness to their previous conversation. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Their usual habit of discussing the little things in life had shifted to heavy, distrustful, and fearful glances. "Audrey, I've been thinking a lot about this," Tanner began as they sat at the table. "I can't imagine how we can move forward after what we learned. Audrey remained silent for a few seconds before responding. She knew he was right, but she also realized there was something more between them that needed to be addressed. "Tanner, I want to do a DNA test," she suddenly said, unable to hold back her thoughts any longer. Her words came out cold and sharp, as if she were speaking with someone else's voice. Tanner looked at her in surprise. "A DNA test? Do you think that—" "Yes, I want to be sure there's nothing between us that could prevent us from being together," Audrey explained, trying to avoid his gaze. "I just want to be certain." Tanner fell silent. He didn't immediately grasp what she meant, but then his expression changed as the meaning of her words sank in. He knew that in their situation, this was the only way to clarify the truth once and for all. "Okay," he replied quietly after a long pause. "If it helps us understand where we stand, then I'm willing." The next day, they both went to the clinic to provide samples for the test. Audrey felt a heaviness in her heart as the doctor took their blood samples. She couldn't shake the feeling that this procedure would change their lives forever, regardless of the results. The week they waited for the test results felt endless. Audrey woke up every morning thinking about what would come next. She tried to avoid communication with her parents, and her conversations with Tanner became brief and formal. Finally, the day came when the test results were ready. Audrey and Tanner arranged to meet at the clinic to learn the truth together. As they entered the doctor's office, Audrey felt her heart start to race. The doctor sat at the desk with papers in his hands, his expression serious. The paternity test results showed. He began, but Audrey could no longer hear the rest of his words. Everything around her seemed to darken, and the sound of his voice grew distant and blurred. "You are not siblings," the doctor finally stated. Audrey froze, unable to believe her own ears. She heard the doctor, but the words he spoke didn't quite reach her consciousness. It felt as if the air had suddenly vanished from the room, and her thoughts floated like shadows in a fog. Tanner, standing beside her, appeared equally bewildered. His face took on a shade of shock. The doctor looked at them with concern, but also knew he couldn't prolong this conversation. "I understand that this news may be unexpected, but the test results are conclusive. You are not biological siblings," the doctor repeated, watching their reactions. Audrey finally gathered her strength and asked the question that had been haunting her. "So, does this mean we can be together? That this doesn't stop us?" Tanner, as if awakening from a deep sleep, looked at Audrey with urgency. He felt their lives would never be the same again, but he also knew there was something stronger between them than their circumstances. "It doesn't mean everything will be easy," Tanner said, leaning closer to Audrey. "It means we can try, but there are many other factors that affect our relationship." The doctor, noticing how difficult this was for Audrey and Tanner, tried to encourage them. "You need to give yourselves time to process this news. Talk to each other. Try to understand what each of you is feeling." They left the office, and the world outside suddenly felt different. The phrase brother and sister no longer defined their relationship, but new feelings and emotions wove together into a new reality. Outside, Audrey stopped, trying to comprehend everything that had happened. The wind played with her hair, and she felt the heavy weight pressing on her chest gradually lift. "Tanner, we need to figure out what to do next," she said, looking at his face, which still appeared confused. "I know," he replied, "but please tell me what you feel. I want us to be honest with each other." Audrey took a deep breath. "I feel both fear and joy at the same time. I'm scared there might be nothing between our families, but I want to try. I want us to have a chance." Tanner nodded, agreeing with her words. They walked home together, realizing that they could start anew only if they were willing to open up to each other. Weeks passed, and Audrey and Tanner tried to rebuild their relationship. They began meeting more often, spending time together, but tension still lingered in the air. Each of them struggled to cope with the aftermath of the news they had learned. Audrey couldn't stop thinking about her parents, who had kept the truth hidden for so long. They had tried to protect her, but now that she knew the secret, that information forced her to reevaluate everything that had happened in their family. She decided to talk to her mother once more. When Audrey sat down with Diane again, she felt like she was trying to break through a wall that had emerged between them. "Mom, I want to understand why you and Dad chose to stay silent. Why didn't you tell me earlier about what happened?" Diane sighed again, but this time her gaze was filled with regret. "I thought it would remain in the past. I tried to protect you, but now I see that our decisions led to even greater pain." "Tanner and I are no longer siblings," Audrey replied, trying to hold back tears. "But how can we be together now if there's such tension between our families?" "I understand, it's hard," Diane said, her voice trembling. "But perhaps your relationship can become something new if you're willing to embrace it." Audrey nodded, but inside she felt no lighter. She knew their love would face many challenges. She returned to Tanner with new doubts, but still full of hope. One evening, Tanner decided to talk to Audrey about something important. He invited her for a walk to their favorite spot, where they always celebrated their small victories. When they reached the park, Tanner stopped and turned to her. "Audrey, I've been thinking a lot about us," he began, focusing his gaze on her face. "I want us to be happy, but I can't shake the thoughts about what happened between our parents." Audrey understood he was right. It was an important issue that weighed heavily on them. "I've thought about it too," she replied. "But we can't change the past. We can only influence what's happening now." Tanner nodded, but anxiety still lingered in his eyes. "But if our parents can't forgive each other, how can we move forward?" Audrey paused to think. "Maybe we need to talk to them. Tell them we want them to try to resolve their issues. Perhaps if they understand that we're not to blame for their mistakes, it might help." Tanner considered her words. "That might be risky, but I'm willing to try. I don't want to lose you because of what happened in the past." They headed home, contemplating how to approach the conversation with their parents. It was a daunting and frightening thought, but they knew that the only way to change things for the better was through openness and honesty. When Audrey and Tanner gathered for the conversation with their parents, the atmosphere was tense. They decided that the best option would be to meet in a family setting, where both families could express their thoughts and feelings. At the meeting, Audrey and Tanner were initially nervous, as neither they nor their parents knew how the conversation would unfold. Tanner took the first step, addressing his father. "Dad, we wanted to talk about what happened between you and Audrey's family. I know it's a difficult topic, but we need to understand how to move forward," he began, his voice steady. Victor, Tanner's father, looked bewildered but nodded, encouraging his son to continue. Diane also took the initiative. "We know a lot of time has passed, but there are still many unresolved questions. I don't want you kids to suffer because of our mistakes." As the conversation began, Audrey felt the heavy atmosphere surrounding them again. Everyone present was trying to find words that wouldn't hurt, but despite their efforts, the truth always remained difficult. "We need to find a way to let go of what happened in the past," Peter finally said, addressing Victor. "The kids deserve to be happy. They're not to blame for our mistakes." Victor sighed heavily. "I know, but how can I forgive? How do I do that when I remember that time?" Audrey and Tanner listened intently to their parents, their hearts beating in unison, knowing their future depended on these words. "It may be hard for both of you, but we still want to try," Audrey said, holding Tanner's hand. "We want you to forgive each other, so we can move forward together." These words seemed to resonate with both parents. They pondered the fact that their children were willing to support each other despite all the difficulties. The meeting became a significant moment for both families. Although feelings of guilt and shame didn't disappear immediately, the conversation allowed them to express feelings and experiences that had accumulated over the years. In the following weeks, Audrey and Tanner watched as their parents tried to rebuild their relationships, learning to forgive one another. Although disagreements still arose from time to time, the families began to communicate and attempt to become close again. Audrey and Tanner jointly supported their parents, which, in turn, strengthened their own relationship. One evening, while walking together in the park, Tanner stopped and looked at Audrey. "You know, I've always believed that love can conquer all," he said, his voice filled with tenderness. "We've been through many trials, But now I feel ready for a new beginning." Audrey smiled, feeling her heart swell with joy. "I believe that too, Tanner. We can overcome everything together." They embraced, and in that moment, Audrey realized that despite all the challenges, their love could truly prevail. They began planning their future together, sharing ideas, dreams, and hopes. They decided they wanted to try to build a new story, where their parents could be part of their lives rather than an obstacle. Together, they set about preparing wedding plans, dreaming of a bright future where all relationships would heal. As Audrey and Tanner's wedding approached, their parents managed to overcome all misunderstandings. At the celebration, they supported their children and witnessed their new love that united both families. As Audrey walked down the aisle, her heart beat in rhythm with her dreams. She looked at Tanner, who was waiting for her, with tenderness and confidence that everything would be different now. After exchanging vows and celebrating with family, Tanner and Audrey realized that their love had grown stronger, and the bonds between their families had solidified. Together, they built a new foundation for their relationship, leaving behind past traumas. When the celebration ended and the newlyweds spent their first night together, Audrey knew that many challenges lay ahead, but she was ready to face them with Tanner by her side. "We'll get through this together," she whispered, closing her eyes and feeling his warmth. And indeed, in their hearts, there always remained the hope that in love, there was no room for the past. They left all old wounds behind and chose a path filled with new feelings and shared dreams.